Well, any of you that were involved with agriculture for the last 15 years or so probably recall that there was beginning to be a huge gap when some of the legends at the University of Minnesota started to retire. People like Giles Randall and George Ream, Gary Mulzer, so forth. And fortunately, at that time, the Minnesota corn growers stepped up to the plate and provided some very generous support to replace some of that expertise. And fortunately, that brought Fabian to Minnesota. Fabian came in 2013. He is a professor at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, and he's also the co-director of graduate studies at the University of Minnesota. Fabian's going to talk about polymer-coated urea, and he's been a huge recipient of a number of our AFRAC funding mechanisms. So please welcome Fabian.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate you attending, and today I would like to talk about some of the research that I've been doing over the years, and more intensively now, currently starting about 2 years ago with ESN. ESN is a polymer-coated urea, and John, in his presentation earlier, also mentioned a little bit of this, the fact that anhydrous ammonia used to be the big player in the state as a nitrogen source, and it has pretty much been replaced by urea. This is tonnage of nitrogen sales over time since 2010, and you can see how urea has increased while anhydrous continues to decline. And so, and these two sources of nitrogen, anhydrous and urea, are not the same. Urea is more susceptible to nitrogen loss compared to anhydrous ammonia in general. And so we need to learn how to manage with this source of nitrogen. Now, just a quick definition here in terms of enhanced efficiency fertilizers, what it means for enhanced efficiency fertilizers. This is the definition. The official definition is a fertilizer that has been modified in some way to do two things. One is to reduce nitrogen loss to the environment, or to increase its availability for the crops. And one of those enhanced efficiency fertilizers is this ESN product, or polymer-coated urea. And there are several different kinds of inhibitors, and so you have, or enhanced efficiency fertilizers. You have inhibitors on one hand, which protect nitrogen from loss, urease inhibitors, nitrification inhibitors, and then we have slow or controlled release fertilizers, and those are kind of divided into two major categories. We have some that are related to physical restrictions, or they protect nitrogen physically, and then others are more of a chemical or biochemical process. And so today I will be talking about specifically about polymer-coated urea, and the way that this product work, and I will be exclusively talking about ESN, is the only product really that is out there in the market available for row crop agriculture. There are other products that are more expensive. They tend to be more for specialty crops. The way that ESN works is that it has this polymer coating outside the urea granule. Water over time starts to get through into the granule. It dissolves the urea, and then the urea dissolves. Dissolved urea starts to come out of that coating into the soil. And that takes a while. And so you can see here in the picture, you have some granules of urea where they're still solid or partially solubilized or completely solubilized. And then what remains is this, the polymer, it's empty. It's basically an empty bag at that point later in the season. And so we are actually doing some work right now because of issues with microplastics in the environment. We are going to, hopefully, I submitted a proposal. Hopefully we'll be able to start doing some work in looking at what happens to those polymer coats. You know, how do they degrade? What happens to them in the environment? There are a lot of questions about plastics, microplastics, and that includes agriculture. One of the major things that we need to know about this polymer-coated urea is that the release is dependent on temperature. That's the main driver for the release of nitrogen. And so you can see here in this graph different temperatures from 41 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the amount of or cumulative nitrogen that was released as a percent of the total. And you can see as it gets warmer, that release curve also increases and goes quicker. Moisture is also a player, but it's not as important. And this particular slide is from Dr. Kelly Nelson from Missouri, where they had a study looking at flood versus normal, you say, normal field conditions. And you can see that, after flooding in some years, they did get a little bit more of a release, but the moisture is not the limiting factor. And so typically there is enough moisture in the soil to start the release without any problem. And so you can see that kind of in this data here. And then for a caveat, I guess, to this is that when you apply ESN, if it's very dry, that can be a problem. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is an example that shows clearly what happens with a blend of ESN and urea. So on the left, you have 100% ESN, on the right, you have 100% urea, and then blends in between. And this was in a particularly dry year where we applied this as a side dress treatment, okay? So it was these treatments were applied as side dress around V4, V5. And you can see that in the dry conditions, the treatments with the more urea on the left, with most urea in the left, they produce a good yield relative to the others. And as you increase ESN, this became more of a problem. Why? Because the dry conditions basically prevented nitrogen from releasing out of those granules into the soil. And you can see that clearly in here. And again, this is actually the picture and the study was actually done in Illinois. In 2012, if you remember, it was a droughty year. It was not as bad in here, but it was extremely dry in Illinois. And that picture that you see there, I took it at harvest time. And you could see some of the granules still sitting there on top of the soil. So extreme case, but it points out to the fact that if you have dry conditions, it could be a problem because it will not release in time, especially if it's sitting on the soil surface. And then the other thing is that, and I will show you some more data, split applications, I would not recommend using ESN as a split application, especially if it's a later application in the season, because at that time, what you need is nitrogen that is available to the crop right now, not in 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now. But it works very well for pre-plant applications. This is some of the data that from the studies that we are conducting right now. This is looking at release curves of the nitrogen. So we apply this nitrogen and we install these mesh bags with fertilizer in them. And Jeff is here. He has helped us at Waseca. I'm not presenting the Waseca data, but I have data for 4 locations. We are doing this study at 4 locations. We basically look at in Rosemount and Becker, we have applications at V2, V6, and then V10. And so we are looking at the release of this nitrogen from the polymer coating at these stages. And then in Lambert and Waseca, we are applying fertilizer at pre-plant and then V6. But we also as a comparison, we are also looking at, we put these bags at V10 just to look at the release. And what you can see there very clearly is that the curves all look fairly similar in terms of how urea gets released out of these capsules. But the interesting thing is that when you look at that V6 application or even a V10 application, you can see that delay. And that's, again, what I was mentioning, that at that point, you don't want to be applying something that will be available in a few weeks. You want something that is available now because the crop is ready to take it up. And so that can be a problem. And in Lamberton actually shows it even more drastically. This was 2021, which was pretty dry. And you can see how those later applications, the emergence, the one at pre-plant was pretty quick. The others had a much bigger delay in terms of releasing nitrogen. One thing that I will mention too is that ESN protects nitrogen from volatilization loss. So it works great if you're going to leave it on the surface compared to like urea, for instance. But the challenge is that because of the coating, if there is water runoff, this coating basically makes it impermeable, and so it will float with water. And so you have to be careful with that. So I always encourage people to incorporate it with tillage, even if we expect really flat, if you have a very flat field, you feel like I'm safe. I've seen it in this particular study. You can see it here. It was a very flat field, and we had runoff event, and we had all the fertilizer at the end of the plots. The other thing is with handling. So this is extremely important with ESN. What is protecting urea is that coating, and if that coating breaks, basically what you're buying is expensive urea. The coating, if it's cracked or if it's broken in some way, it's basically urea. So water will come in and it will dissolve just like urea would right away. And so making sure that you get a source of ESN that has gone through the least possible handling is important, especially if you're using it early in the season. If you have, rusty, I cannot think of the word right now. Yes, thank you. If that's the case, then you are basically sending that granule through a sandpaper, if you will. You're eating up all that coating, and you're buying urea at that point. The other thing has, Carl Rosen did some work with this, looking at air boom spreaders tend to be more rougher than spinach spreaders in terms of the damage that you can cause. And my suggestion would be, if you buy ESN, you want to see the integrity of that coating, is grab some of that material at the time of the application. So if you're using spin spreader, collect some from the spin spreader, put it in water, let it sit there overnight, and then look at the next morning and see how many of those granules are still there. If they're still there, it means that the coating is protected. If it's all dissolved, that means that you're basically applying urea. So let's talk a little bit about where I think, based on the research that I've been doing over the years, where ESN may be most likely to provide a benefit. This is a study where we had it over 4 years. We had 3 different nitrogen sources: anhydrous, ESN, and urea. And you see here that as an average, there was no difference between the treatments. This was a very suboptimal N rate. It was only 100 pounds. But in a wet year, out of those 4 years, you can see that there was a statistical difference. And so if you average across all of the years, maybe you don't see that response, but then with wet years, that's where ESN can really make a difference, because it protects nitrogen from loss early in the spring when we normally tend to have those really wet conditions. This is another study we did here in Minnesota, looking at just one rate of nitrogen. And again, early on, I started here in 2013. I was doing a lot of work as part of other experiments where we would have just one rate of comparison. And so in the last few years, we kind of, based on what we learned from those one rate studies, I think there is some promise in there, some benefits. And so I am doing more work now looking at specifically at rates so we can look at responses. But in this one where we are looking at continuous corn with 120 pounds of nitrogen, so again, a very small amount of nitrogen for that system, we had these over 15 site years in Minnesota. And what you see here is urea and ESN blends of 2:1 or 1:2, 100% ESN, anhydrous ammonia, and anhydrous ammonia with nitroparin. And in coarse texture soils where the potential for nitrogen loss is high, you can see that every step of increase in ESN, you get a yield benefit out of that, because again, you have a lot of potential for loss. These were all pre-plant applications. I know we don't recommend pre-plant applications in the sands, but this was part of a much larger study. So we were maintaining that continuity. And actually John Lamb here in the room, he started that study, and then I picked it up and continued it. So you can see that benefit in there. But then you have on the lower left-hand side with soils with low potential for nitrogen loss. In that case, it doesn't really matter what nitrogen source you use. It's all good. It's all there. And then in fine texture soils with high potential for nitrogen loss, in the top right-hand corner, you can see there that, again, having ESN does help protect nitrogen from loss. Unfortunately, in that site, we had some issues with anhydrous ammonia. So the anhydrous ammonia, I would ask that you don't really pay too much attention to that. But for the dry fertilizers, you can see the benefit of having ESN. And you do see that 100% ESN in that case also kind of started to tick down in terms of the yield. And that has been something that I've seen pretty consistently, that 100% ESN doesn't always work the best, especially in continuous corn systems where you need a little bit of nitrogen early in the season. So having a blend tends to be a much better situation. And then we had one site, which always happens, where there was like no response to nitrogen. So there was no difference to the treatments. I mentioned that moisture in the soil is a big driver for nitrogen loss. You know, and when you look at the nitrogen cycle, that's a big component is weather. And this is some data from Kelly Nelson in Missouri, where they have clay pan soil, so very high potential for nitrogen loss through denitrification, very wet conditions. And they did this study where they compare no flood versus flood. So they flooded purposely. They flooded the field for 7 days, and they compared that versus just normal field conditions with two different hybrids. And you can see there that in the left-hand side, for both the urea versus ESN, whether it was flooded or not flooded, there was a benefit with ESN. It increased the yield. On the right-hand side, there was no difference for the non-flooded, but when there was a flooding, you can see that there was a substantial benefit with having ESN. So again, wet conditions, if you expect to have really wet conditions, and we never know that, right? We cannot really predict the weather very well. But what we know for sure is we have parts of our fields where it tends to be wet. More often than not. Those may be the areas where you want to target an application with ESN compared to urea, because the odds of having a benefit there will be greater. And this is kind of what this slide show. This is again a study that was published a few years ago, where they looked at landscape position and the use of ESN and urea, and then a blend of ESN 50-50 urea ESN. And in the summit and the side slope, where there is good drainage, where there is no potential for a lot of water accumulation, there was no difference between these three nitrogen treatments. But in the low-laying areas, that's where they had a big difference. And you can see the yield difference there with the bar graph, where it really did make a difference. You have the polymer-coated urea or PCU. And this is just kind of a few pictures, kind of looking at the landscape at what you see in terms of the corn crop. This is from that publication that I show you. This is graphically, again, this is some data that Kelly and also graciously provided. And you can see what happened over time. Later on in the season, it dried up, but those low-laying areas were affected, and you can pretty clearly see where those ESN strips are. It did protect nitrogen during that early spring when you had the flooding, the wet conditions. And then later in the season, you can see still those differences. Another thing that I like to point out of this picture is the fact that in the low-laying areas, the corn doesn't look as good as it looks on closer to us, right, in the front of the picture. And that's an important point to keep in mind, that, you know, these technologies do help, but they are not bulletproof. I mean, there are a lot of other factors that impact corn yield and development. You can see those corn plants were farther behind where it was flooded. So there are other issues. So we cannot just throw more nitrogen at that crop and expect that it will just respond. But we can do things to try to minimize the negative impact of things like wet conditions in the field, where we tend to lose most of the nitrogen. We conducted this study here in Minnesota from 2016 through 2020. This was across the state. We had a whole bunch of different studies from Waseca to Crookston and everything in between. We had, I don't remember now how many sites, but we had a number of sites with continuous corn and corn soybean. And what we did here is we looked at comparing these different treatments. They were just at one rate, okay? And what I did is I just created some comparisons here where we are looking at, for instance, the first one, it says anhydrous ammonia produced greater yield than urea as a broadcast and incorporated application. And we were looking at both fall and spring applications. And then we are looking at the number of occurrences. So out of all the potential comparisons that we had out of that study, we had, in this case, we had 30 potential comparisons of anhydrous versus urea. And so what I did is I looked at the occurrence. And for fall application, we found that anhydrous ammonia was better than urea as a broadcast and incorporated application 18 times out of those 30. So a 60% benefit. And then in terms of the bushels, and it's covered here in the room, it's covered a little bit, but it's basically the yield benefit. Whenever there was a benefit, so in those 18 out of 30, the yield increase was 49 bushels compared to urea, okay? So you kind of get a picture here of saying, okay, how often is something like this going to give me a benefit? You know, the probability, the percent chance of getting a benefit out of these comparisons. And the one I want to kind of bring up, because we are talking about ESN, is the last two comparisons there where ESN produced greater yield than urea as a broadcast and incorporated application. For fall application, it was 19% of the time. For spring was 26% of the time. And then there were 4%, the red number, 4% of the time where it was actually the other way around, where urea produced greater yields than ESN. And if I were to break that data down, well, first of all, important point is that for fall application, ESN is not really something that I would recommend using. The main purpose of this study, if you remember, and I talked about this in previous conferences, was to look at fall versus spring applications of urea. I would not recommend using ESN to do the fall application, because just like urea, the potential for loss is too great. I mean, by the time we are concerned about nitrogen loss in the spring, the coating is already breaking and the urea is already releasing the soil, you're getting into nitrate and the potential for loss. But for the spring, you can see, you know, 26%, not great, but a good percentage. But out of those, if I were to drill into that data, that 26% came from those years where we had really wet conditions. Those are the situations where you, again, see the most potential for a benefit using this polymer-coated urea. We did another study where we were looking at not only the nitrate, the crop response, but looking at nitrate leaching and nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions. So kind of looking at the environmental side of things a little bit. We had these 4 treatments. This was in Lamberton, where we apply either urea or ESN at has 180 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant, or we had 2 other treatments where we apply either urea or ESN at 60 pounds pre-plant, and then the remainder at side dress at V6. And here is the yield data. This was done over 7 years from 2014 through 2020. And you can see on average, and I'm sorry, if I can move this little bar away of the slide. Okay, I can. Great. So you can see there that the pre-plant urea was the low yielding treatment. The others yielded fairly well. The best yielding treatment was the split application with ESN in the pre-plant plus the side dress with agrotane. We were using a urease inhibitor there because we were leaving the fertilizer on the surface for the side dress. But, you know, pretty good yields, but they were all basically more or less higher than that pre-plant urea application. And then in terms of the environment, so here in this graph, you're looking at nitrate loss in blue, nitrous oxide, and ammonia loss for these 4 treatments. And you see that compared to from urea to ESN, by doing 100% ESN as a pre-plant application, we reduce nitrogen loss effectively by 48%. That's a huge reduction. Agronomically may not be a huge amount of nitrogen, but environmentally is very important. And then the other interesting thing was that, you know, we talk about split applications as being best management practices, and they do help, especially in really wet springs. But in terms of nitrogen loss for this study, we basically saw no difference. There were no differences compared to the pre-plant urea application. So we are still doing a lot of work with these things, but what is certain is that having ESN as part of the application early in the spring when we have the most potential for loss, it can bring pretty substantial dividends in terms of agronomic performance, at least as good as some of the best practices, and also protect the environment substantially. And again, right now, farmers don't get necessarily a bonus for doing things that protect the environment, but I suspect that down the road, these things will be coming. And again, I consider some of these things a win-win situation because you're protecting the environment without really losing productivity out of your field by using some of these technologies. And here is the economics of that study, okay? Because this is really always one of the most important things for a farmer is, well, does this really pay? And right now, what you see here is, again, the 4 treatments, the net economic return in dollars per acre. And you see that ESN, agrotane, that split application was agronomically was the best, and also ESN, the cost of the prices that I use are there on the right-hand side. ESN is more expensive, but because of that yield increase, it more than pay for that additional cost. And then we also took into account the trip through the field for the split application and everything, right? So you can see here that in terms of cost, on the very top, you see the dollar amounts there. Urea, of course, is the cheapest treatment, but then it goes up, increases to 94, up to $102 per acre for the complete 100% ESN pre-plant application. But then when you look at the net return versus urea, you see that you got $5 more per acre with 100% ESN, 7 more for the split with urea, and $26 more per acre with that blend of ESN and urea. So there are substantial benefits economically as well. So that was one of the studies. And then, like I said, we started in 2021 to look at really in a lot more depth to understand how ESN may benefit us. And so we are doing more of trials with end rate responses so that we can put economics to these treatments. And of course, 2021 was dry, 2022 was dry. And so I'm hoping that this year will be a little bit more normal. But what you're seeing here is we have these 3 treatments. This is all work funded through AFRIC. It's a long-term project where we have urea, and then blend of 2-1 or 1-2 urea ESN. And you see there on the very top is continuous corn for Morris, Lamberton, and Waseca. You have the EONR and then the yield at the EONR. And what I did here simply is I compare the urea treatment, which is the very top one in blue. I don't know how well the blue shows. And then I highlighted with red the economic optimum N rates that were numerically lower than that urea pre-plant application. And you see there with the reds, kind of where you see a benefit, where you needed less nitrogen to get to that economic optimum. And there are a number of those. And again, these were very dry years, so the potential for loss was not very high. And yet still we saw some benefits in some of the locations. The bottom table shows the same thing, but for the locations with corn after soybean. And again, you can see that there are a number of those where we needed less nitrogen to get to that economic optimum. So there is some promise in there. And I suspect, again, if we had more of normal conditions where the potential for nitrogen loss is greater, I suspect that there will be more of a difference. But again, that's why we are continuing to do this research. And this is, let's see. This is for 2022. And again, we didn't see as many where the difference was, we needed less nitrogen compared to urea. There were just a few of those, 4 overall for the continuous corn and corn soybean systems across the state, where we needed a little bit less nitrogen. But I kind of see this consistent thing where the 2-to-1 blend tends to work pretty well, where you have, some urea and then some ESN in that blend to make the crop basically have what it needs really early in the season, but then protect some of that investment of nitrogen early in the season for later availability. And this is now looking at the economics of this. Bill Lazarus is working with me in this project, and we've been looking at the economics as well. On the bottom there, I show the prices that we use. We are actually looking. These were February 2021 prices. We also looked at January 2023 prices, and the net return changes, but the actual treatments and what we saw then really substantially changed very much. And actually with the corn prices being higher now than they were back in 2021, the net returns are actually higher than what you see in here. And so here again, what I did is I highlighted with red the instances where the EONR, or economic optimum N, was lower than for urea. And then in the net return columns with the darker colors, I again show the kind of the reds show the ones where you got a higher return compared to the urea treatments. And so there are a number of those, especially Awasika, over the 2-year period where there was a benefit there. Not so much in Lamberton. In Lamberton, actually, urea performed better. And I think that speaks to what I mentioned earlier, that with dry conditions, ESN does have some difficulty if it's dry, and Lamberton was very dry, especially, well, both years, 2021 and 2022 were very dry, where it doesn't release as quickly. And so here is the other part of this study is we do have these response curves like I show, so we can do the models of how, to determine the economic optimum. But then we have a whole bunch of other treatments where it's just a one-rate comparison at 120 pounds. And we don't really have time to go into a lot of detail for this slide. There is a lot of information in here, but you can see the different treatments we have. Most of them are just pre-plant treatments, but then there are 3 treatments that is a split application with blends and different forms of ESN and urea as blends or individual and so on. You can kind of see there the treatments. And again, what I did is I simply put in red the values where we got better yields or better returns compared to the pre-plant urea application. And so again, just kind of taking a quick look at those red numbers, there are a number of instances there where there is a benefit. So again, dry conditions, maybe not the best situation to test these treatments, but even then, we're still seeing some benefits in there. And then we are doing this same study in the coarse-textured soils at Becker and Rosemount. And for this particular one in Becker, we have, again, continuous corn and corn soybean in 2021, and then the bottom graph is for 2022. And you see that, again, looking at the red numbers, just to make a quick way to look at that, there are a number of instances where you do see a benefit having a blend of having some ESN in the blend for these applications. And for these coarse texture soils, the applications are being done in 3 increments, a V2, V6, and V10. So we apply a third on each one of these applications. And we use those blends as indicated in the slide. And again, looking at the economics now, you see, again, not a huge number of sites where it was more economical or beneficial, but again, truly dry conditions. And in fact, one interesting thing is that if you look at the economic optimum end rates, they were pretty low for sandy soils, which is telling you right there that we lost nearly no nitrogen in these 2 years, just simply because there was not a lot of water to move it. And we were able to obtain good yields because we do have irrigation in this system. So if you were irrigating correctly, managing irrigation correctly, then you have no potential for nitrogen loss and a lot to gain from it. And then at these sandy sites, we also have a huge number of comparisons. These are all done at one rate. And again, we don't have time to go through all of these, but you can see the very top one is the 3-way split with just urea, and then all of the other ones are using different blends of ESN and urea as a 3-way application, two-way application, or as a single application at V2. And so, again, no time to go through each one of these individually right now, but just looking kind of at the red numbers where there is a benefit. Again, we are seeing that there are some potential benefits there with some kinds of blends of ESN in the mixture. Even when we are doing everything in terms of best management practices, applying nitrogen as the application for these sandy soils, we do see that compared to just using only urea, there are some potential benefits there. And like I said before, I suspect that if we have wet conditions, these things will probably even look better based on what I have seen before with some of the research doing with single rates. So with that, I just want to take a moment to thank, first of all, the field crew, the St. Paul field crew, and the ROCs and the people that work at the ROCs that help us with all these projects. It's a tremendous amount of work that it takes to collect this data, and so I could not do that without their help. So thank you to them, and also to all the agencies and groups that are listed there for their funding and support. So with that, I will just put a plug in for the conference. Oh, well, it went away, but there's another conference coming up in a couple of weeks in St. Cloud. So you are all invited. Thank you. There. All right, the first question. Any estimates of the percentage of Minnesota corn acres that are using ESN? Good question. I don't really have an answer. What I have seen, and this is anecdotal, is that I have seen an increase in the acreage of people using ESN. And I think it has to do with the fact that we have seen really wet conditions, except for the last few years. We have been seeing really wet conditions. And again, a lot of this research that we are doing is showing that there are potential benefits to using ESN in those wet conditions. Next question is, how does UAN compare to urea ESN in split applications? We have actually not looked at that comparison. My suspicion, and this is total just suspicion because I have not looked at that specific comparison, is that if you have wet conditions at side dress, and we have seen, in the last 10 years I've been here, most years have been kind of wet in June, where we are normally doing side dress application. UAN, 50% of it is urea, and then a quarter of that is nitrate. And so that urea will convert to nitrate fairly quick, especially at side dress time. And then UAA, the nitrate portion of UAN is already nitrate, so it's ready to be lost if there are conditions for that. So my suspicion is that if you have a blend, it will probably work a little bit better, because even if you're applying, again, I don't recommend doing split applications with ESN, but if you have that part of the blend of ESN as an early pre-plant application or very early side dress application, it will still be releasing nitrogen at that point. And so you're probably protecting it. If it's not extremely wet, I suspect it will not be much of a difference between UAN versus these blends. All right. Next question is temperature plus humidity a factor in ESN coating integrity? Not that I know. I mean, if it's stored properly, right? I mean, if it's in a wet, really wet environment, it probably will be a problem. But over time, just potential for degradation, things like that. But if it's stored under, what you would consider normal conditions, it should not be any problem. With a 48% reduction in N loss by using all ESN, where did the N that was not environmentally lost go? Plant uptake, still not released? Good question. So we do have, and I didn't have time to show all of that, but we do have all the nitrogen taken up by the plant and in the grain, and it was taken up. It was not left in the field. So it was all released in time for the crop to use it. So it was used by the crop. Next question, is ESN considered the best current method of extending end release? I don't know if the best method, I think is one of the methods. I think we need to be strategic on how we use the tools that we have in our toolbox. I have, again, the reason we are doing all of this work more intensively is because I have seen some benefits in there, and I want to really get to the point where we can look at the economics and seeing how well it works. Because if it works great, but it's extremely expensive and not a viable alternative for farmers, then it's a problem, right? And so we want to look at the economics, and so far they seem to be working pretty well. I mean, you saw those economic returns on the different blends and things, and even if it's not the highest, they are not that far off from some of the best ones. And so but it is definitely a benefit, but it's not the only tool in the toolbox. And so my suggestion, again, when we are looking at ESN, strategically, I would target areas of the field where you have more potential for loss. So low-laying areas of the field, for instance, or sandy soils, those situations where you have more potential for loss, that's where I would definitely use that. And you have heard me talk about other tools, nitrification inhibitors and things like that as well before. Is urea a better nitrogen source than 28%? I don't think so. I have not done a lot of work with UAN. There have been a lot of work done with UAN versus urea over the years. I particularly have not done a lot of that. I think both sources of nitrogen work very well. Again, UAN, I see it as a benefit, and I see in the sales that UAN sales are increasing slightly. I see a benefit for a side dress application. I would not recommend using UAN at a pre-plant time. What's your thought on N stabilizer products like New Charge G? Ooh. I don't even know what that product is. One of the challenges, and this is, if you hear me talk about different inhibitors and things like that, you know that kind of my view on these things. We are bombarded. There are so many things in the market right now with some kind of a stabilizer or inhibitor properties or something. And first of all, we don't have enough time or resources at the university to do the testing of all these things that are coming out. And so I would say if you are interested in a product, test it with caution. Don't put it in every acre. Do a test. There will be a talk later. I'm talking a little bit about on-farm research. So use some of those techniques to do your own on-farm research to see whether it works or not. All right. And then the last one here is on manure acres that need more nitrogen. Will you anticipate ESN applications to be as beneficial, to be as beneficial, or does the manure provide late season nitrogen? Well, you know, manure is a slow release product in a way, right? It will release over time in the season. Again, I think I would say if you need nitrogen, whether you're using ESN or something else, it's probably good to apply that additional nitrogen. I mean, that's how the question is phrased, if you need additional nitrogen for that application. And I think it will hold true just like it does for anything else, where if you have potential for nitrogen loss early in the spring, ESN most likely will give you additional benefits than using urea for that pre-plant application with the manure. So. All right. Thank you very much.